Welcome to the American Institute of Architects Kansas City Chapter's Legends and Leaders program. This series highlights AIA architects and others that have helped shape our community, lead the AIA, and mentor a new generation of designers. Since 1983, architectural historian Cydney Millstein has dedicated her career to documenting the built environment and fostering the importance of historic preservation locally and nationally. Cydney has written and lectured extensively, and her professional presence includes presentations to AIAKC, the Society of Architectural Historians, National Trust for Historic Preservation, and the Society for Industrial Archaeology, where she served as chair for the organization's conference in Kansas City in 2016. Cydney has also appeared on Kansas City Public Television, the History Channel, and international CNN. Throughout her career, Cyd's work has led to the preservation of hundreds of irreplaceable historic buildings, working with leading AE firms and governmental agencies, including the National Park Service, the Department of Energy, the Department of Defense, and the National Guard Armory. These successful projects have led to renewed vibrancy in our national cities. Much of her work on historic buildings and bridges have helped expand the knowledge base on previously neglected subjects important to the overall understanding of our architectural and industrial heritage. To this end, many of Cydney's documents are filed with the Library of Congress. Cydney has completed projects encompassing well over 500 buildings, landmarks, and sites across the United States. Some of her more notable projects include the Obama Presidential Center, the Kansas City Parks and Boulevard System, and the National World War I Museum and Memorial. In 2018, the Kansas City chapter of the AIA named Cydney the Preservationist of the Year, and in 2022, the City of Kansas City honored Cydney for her contributions to the built environment, architectural preservation, and the beauty of Kansas City, Missouri. In 2023, the National AIA awarded Mrs. Millstein Honorary AIA membership, only one of 3 awards that year. Let's meet Cydney.
Hello, this is Cindy Fruin, and I'm talking to Cyd Millstein today, an architectural historian here in Kansas City. She's been working here for several decades. We met in the 80s, and we're happy to see you here in our Legends and Leaders for the AIA Kansas City chapter.
Thank you, Cindy. I'm so pleased to be doing this.
Well, we're happy you're here. Very excited. So, Cydney, your recognition as an honorary AIA, it's a very high level. It's the highest level of recognition that we have in the AIA. It's a national award, but promoted or nominated by the local chapter. Why don't you tell a little bit about that process and who was involved
Well, initially Kirk Gastinger, who's a fellow AIA and a colleague and good friend of mine, called and said that the local AIA chapter, had nominated me to throw my hat in the ring, so to speak, to get this award. And I thought, great. What do we have to do? Yeah. Had I known, maybe I would have said, it's daunting to put these, as you know, it's daunting to put these packages together. So over the course of 2 years, with the help of Don Taylor, Tom Nelson, and of course, Kirk Gastinger, and a graphic designer, Jeffrey Isom, we put together a package that I think we turned in at the end maybe of 2022, and then in 2023 I got like a one-liner, congratulations, you've been awarded the honorary AIA. And I thought, that's it, all that work that we've done, and I just get a one line, you know. But I was so pleased. I mean, it was a great cap to my career.
Absolutely, it is a high level of recognition because we've only had a couple of them here in Kansas City over, 40 or 50 years' time. So.
I think I may be wrong, but I think there are only 6. I'd like to thank right here the AIA Kansas City chapter for nominating me, and for the folks that worked on that submittal, because I'm so proud of it. I'm so proud of the nomination.
We're proud you did it.
Thank you.
So we start out with information about your background. Architectural historians are pretty rare in the United States, and what got you interested in doing that?
Well, I have to say that my career path was very organic. In fact, if you really talk about a career path back when I was in undergraduate school, I had no idea what I wanted to do. I initially was a Spanish major and was a Spanish major for 2 years. And then I had to take an elective, and I thought, I'll take art history, that's gotta be easy. And took art history, and I think there were about 100 people in the class, so it wasn't a personal class by any stretch, but I was smitten. And I changed my major, and I also changed schools. I was at Bradley University in Peoria, Illinois, and then switched to Kansas University for undergraduate, and then fast and furious went through the art history program, which typically was 4 years, and then got a degree in 2. I think they counted some of my Spanish, toward whatever hours I needed. My degrees are in art history, undergraduate and graduate, and what really inspired me, besides the art history, to go into this field was that I was always surrounded by artists, people in the arts, and I also lived in the urban core my entire adult life, so I was surrounded by what the urban core had to offer, and my love of art and architectural history just took over. Regarding the career, I never really thought about anything except being in the arts.
Well, I wondered, consequently, who were some of the early mentors you had, people that influenced your career?
Early on in undergraduate school, I would have to say George Ehrlich. He was a faculty member at UMKC and a strict academic, and also an accomplished photographer of our urban core. He was someone who really taught theory of art history. And looking back, it was interesting because we had a lot in Kansas City to study, out in the field, so to speak. But in graduate school, we learned about art history 2- and 3-dimensional by looking at slides in a dark room. Yeah. And oftentimes, I would either kind of nod out, because the classes were pretty early. It just was interesting because I never recall ever going to a museum. I never recall going into the field to study, but I think I got a very good beginning of, what it takes to be an architectural historian through studying with George. And then long after graduate school, I had the good fortune to meet Eric Deloney, who was chief of Historic American Engineering Record for a number of years, I think probably 25 years, and he served as chief of that department. And he was a pioneer in historic bridge documentation. He was also an architect, and he was one of the leading experts in the history of bridge design, not only in the United States, but in Europe as well. And because of Eric, my focus in part became really, from 2-dimensional art and architecture to industrial heritage. And that was really exciting because Eric took us all out in the field. And that was the first time, really, I got to experience, with a host of individuals that were steeped in the history of architecture, industrial architecture, to see it firsthand and to get feedback from the experts like Eric Deloney. So, I was very, very fortunate to have met him. Eric passed away about, I think it was 2000, I think it was about 8 years ago. And I miss him terribly.
That's the thing about this point in our careers, is that many of our early mentors are no longer with us. Well,
exactly.
But their work lives on, and through people like you. What about the architectural historians and critics in the field? I mean, there aren't that many. Are there some of them that really influenced your career?
Well, again, I'm going to talk about, I think all of them. They're no longer with us. The first the architectural historian that I read over and over again was Ada Louise Huxtable. And she was the first architecture critic for the New York Times, and also won the first Pulitzer Prize in criticism. She was a terrific writer. She was also very witty, very funny, and she would pack in so much information to her articles, to her books. And I would find myself, in awe, and then I would also see myself chuckling at what Huxtable had to write. And so,
Like, have you kicked a building lately?
yes,
And that sort of thing.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
Very engaging.
And she was of small stature, and when she'd go out to the site, she'd often have these very heated discussions with whoever was on site, a building she either liked or disliked. So that was one of them.
Well, besides Ada Louise Huxtable, anybody else you want to mention?
A couple other individuals. Leo Steinberg, who was an art critic, and among the books that he wrote, I still have one of his books on my bookshelf, and I think this book is from the 70s, but I guess you'll have to quote me because I'm sitting here, right? It's called Other Criteria, and Leo Steinberg was such a powerful writer, and I just learned the other day, I was looking some things up about Leo. English was his third language, and you would never, ever realize that from, reading his book, because it's so powerful. He had such a great understanding of what it is to understand the arts, and contemporary art, in this case, with Other Criteria. And he wrote without the heaviness of academic jargon, which I was very attracted to since I had so much of it in graduate school. So Leo came, it was a very happy discovery. There are a couple other people I'd like to mention briefly, and this has more to do with looking at our urban environment, and that's the Bechers, I think I'm pronouncing that right, Bern and Hilla Becher. They were a husband and wife team, and very, very accomplished, very well-known internationally photographers, and they took photographs of our industrial landscape. So this very much tied in with, how at the time my focus was shifting toward the industrial landscape of the United States, and they took very formal frontal images of gas tanks, water towers, grain elevators, our industrial landscape that to me, even before I became familiar with their work, they really looked like cathedrals of our collective landscape. I always stopped in front of, the more remarkable industrial sites and thought, why am I so attracted to these? And then I came upon, the work of the Bechers, and I thought, okay, maybe I wasn't so far off. Their images of these typologies are rendered so beautifully, and I have probably all the books on their work, in my collection.
Well, and you were always working with architects, and both in terms of the historic architects and then the people that you worked with on projects. Are there any of those that you particularly enjoyed?
Yes. Early on, I think the first project of my career was with Kirk Gastinger, and we worked on the Palace Clothing Company, and I believe, Cindy, you worked with Kirk in his office on Baltimore. So, it opened a world that I wasn't that familiar with. I mean, I'd read a lot about architecture, read a lot about, the world of architects, but I never had really, until '83, my first project, worked with architects. So that really opened my eyes, and I thank you in person.
We were all pups at the time, right? We were just all starting out. It was a good time to be an architect in Kansas City. So I'm wondering also, talking more about your career, you actually took a few, because there wasn't architectural historians that were really active, or not very many here in Kansas City, you took sort of some sideways directions in order to get some notoriety, to get people knowing what you were doing. And I learned more about your work that way as well. For instance, the Kansas City Business Journal, You were writing a column that all of us read avidly at the time.
Did you really read it?
Of course we did. Everybody did.
That's great. That's great. Well, early on, again, I hate to sound like a broken record, but I didn't know where this career path was going to take me, and I didn't really have a career path. I just, like I started out with, I loved the arts and I loved architecture, and I just kept the ball rolling, in those two spheres, no pun intended. So the list should include adjunct faculty stints in art history, writing a column, as you mentioned, for the Kansas City Business Journal, and I had a terrific editor there. And I don't know if it was a monthly column, I just can't remember, but he said, you're on your own, you've got so many words, so many columns, and just write it and we'll print it. And I thought, is my writing that good? And he was an editor. He was a very good editor. I'm so sorry I can't remember his name right now. And then I was also the editor, I think for about 3 or 4, assistant editor for the Society of Architectural Historians newsletter. And so, I think, that refined my way of looking at the printed word and how I was reacting to, what other people were writing. And they didn't fire me, so, I guess I did my job. And because of the last two, my name started getting around and my landline started ringing.
Yes, when we had the landline.
When we had the landline.
Well, what were some of the most interesting projects you worked on then?
Well, one of the most challenging and interesting projects of my career must include my work on 635 miles of a railroad corridor covering the old Chicago and Northwestern Railroad that was bought up by the Dakota, Minnesota, and Eastern Railroad in order to bring coal out of Wyoming. So we were hired, I was hired as a subcontractor by Burns & McDonnell. Can I plug them? And then I, in turn,
You just did, certainly.
I in turn took on a colleague of mine, and I dialed her up and I said, Charlene, do you want to work on this project? She says, what is it? And I said, 635 miles of a railroad corridor and the width of South Dakota and the width of Minnesota. And she said, you're kidding, right? Because she knows I'm a kidder. And I said, no, I thought they were kidding when they, asked me to subcontract. So anyway, long story short, we covered the width of Minnesota and the width of South Dakota. I was responsible for photographing all the above ground structures, including architecture, parts of the railroad, which involved culverts, bridges, you name it, depots. And back in the day, we were shooting 35 millimeter black and white film with an SLR camera. So at the end of the field work, I had 99 rolls of film. And I remember taking them over to Custom Color, and I said, you have got to promise me nothing is going to happen to these rolls of film, because I don't know what I would have done. Yeah. Had some of them not come out, or they dropped it on the floor. So anyway, that was one of the projects. Charlene was responsible for all the field notes for all the structures. Another project was working at the Pratt Whitney plant. It's a landmark of American industrial design, which stood at 95th and Bannister, and I'm sure many Kansas Cityans had driven past there umpteen times.
But we call it
Bendix.
Yeah.
But originally it was built for Pratt Whitney by one of my favorite architects. I never met him, but after this project, he became a hero in my eyes. His name is Albert Kahn. He was an industrial designer and responsible for, among other things, all the Ford plants, a lot of the early automobile plants, and most of what you see, the richness of Detroit, was designed by Albert Kahn.
Very well done, yes.
So that was another project, and as an offshoot of that project, we had created, or curated, if you will, an exhibit for the Belger Art Center of a selection of the large format black and white photographs taken by Richard Welnowski on the project. And I also wrote the didactics for this exhibit, and it was such a success that Belger extended the time that it was up. I think it went from 3 months to 6 months, something like that, because people were literally coming out of the woodwork to see the exhibit. A lot of people that worked at Pratt Whitney came to see the exhibit, so that was very successful. It was called The Velocity of Change, and as a result of that, KCPT interviewed me about Albert Kahn and Pratt & Whitney. So there's a lot of mileage, that came out of that project.
It's really part of your brilliance was making these sort of hidden in plain sight information available and accessible to people so that people tuned into it.
Mm-hmm. There's one more, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, it's Liberty Memorial, now the National World War I Museum and Memorial, which is where we're sitting.
Which is where we are, yes.
Right now, we're in the research library, very different from when, I worked here. I worked on this project for I think it was about 10 years. I'd have to really look it up, but after they closed the memorial, I think it was in '94, I don't know if you remember that, because the deck was failing, then everything was put into motion, not only redesigning the memorial, but also preparing all the required documents surrounding the memorial. And one of the most important documents that I prepared, I think it was the last one, was the National Historic Landmark nomination, which was a result of that, in part, was the United States Congress designating this site our country's official World War I museum. So I was very, very proud of that work. And that was my first National Historic Landmark nomination.
And it was really critical because the existing history of the building, even with this very contemporary interior that it has, it was critical that you got the two married together. So
yes, and I think it's a brilliant design, and there was a lot of outcry about the design, and I fought, and a number of other people fought for it, and here we are today, and it's a world-class site.
So I would like to ask you a little bit about your publishing, too. That's been another piece of your work that has made an impression.
Well, there are several books that I have written. The first one was Houses of Missouri. See if I can remember the date. Houses of Missouri, 1870 to 1940. And then after that was Hair and Hair, Landscape Architects and City Planners, which I co-authored with Dr. Carol Grove, who's a professor of art history at MU. And both of these books received awards. And then the last book that I published was a history of the architecture at the Kansas City Art Institute, and the title of that is Kansas City Art Institute, Architecture and Innovation, 1885 to 2020. And I wrote this book for KCAI, and it chronicles not only the architecture, but the landscape architecture, which they were very surprised about. They didn't expect that I'd be writing a whole chapter on landscape architecture, but I discovered, it went back to my second book, The Hair and Hair Landscape Architects, that their whole master plan was prepared by Hair and Hair. So I was pleased. I don't know how pleased they were at the beginning, but it really, painted the entire complete history of the campus, which I felt was needed. All of these books were published through either academic institutions, private presses, or in the case of the last book I mentioned, the Kansas City Art Institute. So they all came to either Dr. Grove and me, or my last book, they came to me and asked if I would be interested in writing this book. And I couldn't refuse.
Yes, for decades now.
Yes.
Well, so talking about architects, who are our primary audience here at the AIA Kansas City, what are the best resources for us to research historic structures? For instance, the environment surrounding it as well as the buildings. What would you advise?
For projects of a more local nature, I would certainly name 3 repositories. One would be the Missouri Valley Room, or it used to be the Missouri Valley Room, now it's Missouri Valley Special Collections at the Kansas City Public Library. The next one would be the State Historical Society of Missouri Kansas City Research Center. And the third would be Linda Hall, and they're all on the UMKC. Oh, I'm sorry, the first one's at the Kansas City Public Library downtown, and then the last 2 are on the campus of UMKC. And those are the 3 local repositories that, that I would recommend. It really depends. I mean, if it's outside of Kansas City, it depends on the nature of the project. So I can't really specify, any particular repository. But, once you get started on a project, then, your research will take you to wherever the papers land. Perfect.
Well, you've been a great resource through the years. We were lucky to have you in Kansas City, so I'm really happy we were able to have this interview. I'm wondering if you have any closing comments you want to make, or is there other things you want to add?
Yes. First of all, thank you very much again for having me and to talk about, this really rewarding career that I have had. And it's just, I'm kind of pinching myself. It's really been, 40 years. It's just 40 plus years. It's really amazing. And I owe much of my success to Kansas City. I got to know, the city and its culture because I never left. I mean, I was always here. So I had a very strong circle of colleagues and friends, helping me along the way. But I have to say there's still so much to explore. It's not that, I'm retiring, chapter's over. There's nothing else to research. That's absolutely not the case. And these next chapters are awaiting anyone who's willing to participate.
Well, thank you so much for the interview today. This has been a wonderful time talking with you. AIA Kansas City will benefit from your knowledge for decades to come, and we appreciate you being here today.
Well, it's been a pleasure, and thank you very much.